Hello again, and thank you for staying with us. Now, in the lead up to the November 27 general elections in Namibia, polls indicate that Swapo, which has triumphed in all elections since Namibia's independence in 1990, might face defeat for the first time since independence in 1990. Swapo has comparative advantages, but there is growing frustration among voters. For analysis on this, we're joined by Professor Henning Melber, who's an analyst and senior advisor at the Nordic Africa Institute. Professor Melber, good to have you on the program this evening. So as mentioned, Swapo has been the dominant political force in Namibia since independence. What do you think are the key factors contributing to this apparent decline in support in recent years?
Good evening, Kandla. I think Swapo faces similar challenges as other former liberation movements who have seized power in a rather legitimate way and have executed political governance once they were voted into the office. But there is an expiry date looming, and we witnessed it in South Africa. We witnessed it with the landslide shift in Botswana. We are witnessing it with the civil strife situation in Mozambique, you have just been discussing. And the constellation has changed also for Swapo in the sense that voters are not taking it any longer for granted that they owe loyalty to the former liberation movement because there is no reason for them to reward them for having led an anti-colonial struggle which led 34 years ago to independence. We have a new demographic situation in all these countries where the born free are the ones who are the majority of the electorate, and they measure governments by delivery. And the track record of delivery in all these countries is rather poor. So frustration has accumulated, and the interesting thing now to see is to what extent it might also erode the hegemonic status which Swapo has obtained since independence.
I think this speaks to a trend that we are seeing, especially within the African region, of these former liberation parties losing support. But very interesting, in 2019 elections, Swapo lost its two-thirds majority, Prof, and President Hage Geinob's re-election received only 56% of the vote. What does this suggest about the public's perception, especially of Swapo's performance?
It was a classical case of populist rhetoric in the election campaigns when Swapo regained the biggest majority since independence in the elections of November 2014. And President Geingob was elected into office with more than 86% of the votes. Even Vladimir Putin would dream about such a result, and it happened without any manipulation of the electorate. But then Swapo had promised, I don't know, X amount of things. And instead, what happened was that corruption increased, delivery declined. There were a number of unfortunate factors for which you can't blame a government. That was drought, that was COVID-19. But at the end of the day, unemployment skyrocketed. There was no service delivery to the ordinary people. Poverty increased. And like in South Africa, both countries remain the most unequal countries in the world. So voting against Swapo into power and the president with a lot of promises and non-delivery over the 5 years in office has built up such a frustration that for the first time in 2019, this frustration resulted in serious losses of Swapo and in serious decline of support for the re-elected President Geingob. But even more, if I may add, the regional and local authorities elections the next year with a number of new competitors actually were an even bigger blow to Swapo, which lost the control over all the big cities in Namibia, which also is an indication that the new urban demographic composition of the voters is a factor which might impact significantly on election results.
Professor Melber, the rise of opposition parties, particularly Pandulani Tula's Independent Patriots for Change, It seems to have caught Swapo by surprise here. How would you interpret Itula's influence in that region and his potential impact on Swapo's chances, especially in these all-important elections in 2024?
Itula was kind of a joker because in the 2019 elections, he decided to run as so-called independent candidate in the presidential elections, challenging Hage Geingob. But at that time, he was still a member of Swapo. And the weird thing is that the Namibian electoral laws did allow that he, as a Swapo member, could campaign as independent candidate. And he got, without a party, 30% of the votes. Those were the 30% which were lost by Geingob. His votes declined by 30%. So there was no shift by opposition parties. It was basically an internal competitor who managed to get the votes. He was then expelled from Swapo and founded the IPC party, which now is running for the National Assembly and already scored rather big, especially again in the cities when it was the regional and the local authorities elections in 2020. It's to some extent an unknown variable because in Namibia, there are no voter surveys done. There are no polls. The only indicators are the Afrobarometer surveys, and they simply suggest a growing degree of frustration. If that is channeled towards Itula and the IPC or some other of the handful of meaningful parties remains to be seen. But indication suggests that Swapo can't lean back comfortably and think almost automatically, we liberated the country, the voters owe us that we are governing the country. It's not the end of history. And we saw it in South Africa, we saw it in Botswana, and we see it now in a much more unfortunate way in Mozambique.
Yeah. Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah, that's the presidential candidate for Swapo in 2024, very interestingly. How do you see her leadership shaping the future of the party? And how does she compare to Geingob in terms of political appeal?
Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah is more of the same, to put it a bit flippantly. She is one of the second-generation struggle veterans. She left for exile in the mid-1970s. She made a career in Swapo already in exile and has been a member of cabinet since independence. While she would be the first female president elected in Namibia, she is not a feminist. She is very conservative. She was partly trained in Moscow, which also affects her affinities to the regime in Russia, but also in other countries, in China. And she is basically a continuity of the struggle mentality. And that might be a limiting factor when it comes to the decision of voters. But again, I'm speculating. But she is not the alternative from the point of view of an urbanized younger generation, which asks for reproductive rights. She is against abortion, which asks for more liberal values. She is a very strong Christian at the same time. She's rather very conservative. And this is the big question, to what extent she manages, compared with Geingob, who was considered to be a liberal, to really attract and secure the number of young voters, which are the decisive element. In Namibia's elections this year, more than half of the electorate is younger than 35 years.
Yeah.
And Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah is 78.
But given the possibility, Prof, of a second-round election in 2024 for Namibia, how do you view the chances of a candidate from outside Swapo winning the presidency? And what impact would this then have on Namibia's political landscape?
This is actually, Nkandla, the most interesting question. And while it's hypothetical, it's worthwhile to give it a thought. In contrast to South Africa, Namibia has two different elections taking place the same day. The one is for the National Assembly, with an absolute proportional vote for the parties. The other one is for the candidates for president, and the president is in Namibia in parallel elected directly. The presidential candidate requires 50% plus one vote as a minimum to be elected into office. So theoretically, or not even theoretically, practically, it might very well be a situation where for the first time none of the candidates, given the relative support Itula had before, and given that there are several other candidates which attract at least a limited number of voters, that in the first round of the presidential elections, none of the candidates will get 50% plus one vote. Then there would have to be a second round of votes between the two candidates with the most votes. And that predictably would be almost certainly Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah and Penduleni Itula. Now, the question is, if all the other opposition parties rally behind Itula, there might be the unlikely but possible situation that while Swapo remains the biggest party in the National Assembly, the directly elected head of state is a non-Swapo president. And the Namibian president has far-reaching executive powers. But the Namibian president has to recruit the cabinet from members of the National Assembly. And that would limit the options of any other president than a Swapo president if Swapo remains the biggest party in the National Assembly. And then basically the most interesting question will be, is the winner democracy or is the loser democracy? It could be a total disaster of non-collaboration, and the price would again be paid by the electorate. The previous speaker you interviewed on Mozambique said, the poor never win. The poor would not win in such a constellation. But hope dies last. Why not? Is that a constellation which could create coalition politics where democracy wins? And the ANC was setting an example with the election results in South Africa a couple of months ago, willingly accepting the results and seeking a solution in the best interest of the party, basically trying to reinvent itself from a former liberation movement into a modern party which gives priority to good governance as delivery to the ordinary people.